We are really in for a treat this morning. I can say that with full confidence. I had the pleasure of hearing Kevin present at the Lake Union Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Conference earlier this year and was just tremendously blessed. So I'm really looking forward to being here this morning. But let me tell you a little bit about our speaker. Dr. Kevin Burton is, since August of 2021, has served as the director of the Center for Adventist Research. In addition, he is an assistant director of the Ellen G. White Estate and an assistant professor in the Church History Department at the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary at Andrews University. Dr. Burton's doctoral dissertation focused on Adventist involvement in the abolition movement. He has also published several book reviews, encyclopedia entries, monograph chapters, and journal articles on Millerite and Seventh-day Adventist church history. This morning, congratulations are in order for Dr. Burton. His first book, tentatively titled Apocalyptic Abolitionism: How Immediate Millennialists Helped Abolish Slavery and Reform America, is under contract with the New York University Press. So congratulations to Dr. Burton on that. Again, if I can just ask you to stand, we're going to say a quick word of prayer, and then Dr. Burton will present. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for all the blessing that you've given us in our lives. We thank you so much for that first session that we had last night and the opportunity to serve you, Lord, in a posture of justice and mercy and humility. We ask a special blessing on your speaker this morning, and we ask that the Holy Spirit will both speak through him and open our hearts and our minds. We pray all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Who needs stairs? No, I'm just kidding. Good morning, friends. If you're tired, you don't have permission to be tired anymore. We're here to talk about important things, and it's an honor for me to be with you today. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I appreciate so much about what this council stands for, what it's doing, what it's about, and what it has done for nearly a decade. And so, some people have maybe told you that Adventists should not ever engage in politics. Perhaps you've heard that Adventists should never get involved in social justice. Perhaps you've heard it from someone high up in the church, in some official capacity. Friends, I'm here to tell you today that that is not the truth. And I'm here to disabuse us from a whitewashed version of our history. And so saddle up, let's go, because we're going to talk about Adventists, civil engagement, and how we started as a movement and why we started as a movement. And it is a potent critique for us today and for so much of our recent history. So, to set this up, you need to understand the context, friends. So, we know about slavery. Everyone understands something about slavery. We understand that slavery was growing. It was a massive behemoth thing. Well, over the course of all the years in this country's history, there were about 10 million enslaved peoples, right? You probably know some of these basic facts. But there's a recent 2020 estimate that you may not know, which is really enlightening and telling. It was published in the reputable journal Slavery and Abolition, and it estimates that all of these 10 million enslaved people contributed about 410 billion hours of free labor to literally build this country. My friends, try to wrap your mind around 410 billion hours. If you want to take it down a notch, that's 46,772,578 years. This country would not exist without the free labor that it stole and robbed from over 10 million or about 10 million people. But there's another thing that's going on here. You've heard of Jim Crow. Jim Crow existed with slavery. Sometimes people think that Jim Crow was a Southern invention after the Civil War was over. My friends, you need to learn your history. Jim Crow was a northern invention, and it was invented, like in the South, because slavery was abolished there earlier, and white people wanted to come up with a way to make sure that black people were not equal and had the equal opportunities and everything with them. So they came up with Jim Crow. They called it Jim Crow. Segregation everywhere. Here's a quote from the historian Richard Archer that summarizes it in a nutshell. Schools were often not available. Well-paying employment was non-existent. Transportation was segregated or refused. Church attendees were separated so that even visiting African-American ministers had to sit in a distant black pew or balconies. Travelers had to eat in kitchens rather than in dining rooms, or sleep in garrets rather than in bedrooms. All that was abundant was humiliation and disdain, and compounding these troubles, the colonization society was attempting to send free blacks to Africa. Sometimes people confuse colonizationists with abolitionists. My friends, if you had that idea in your head, get rid of it because it's completely wrong. The colonizationists were trying to get black people out of the country. They wanted to make America white. I would say again, but it never has always been white. Okay? And so they are trying to make it white for white people. The abolitionists, by contrast, and the colonizationists were their sworn enemies. They said, absolutely not. We want two things only: immediate and total abolition of slavery, and uncompensated for the slave owners, but let's have compensation for the slaves, and equal rights in America for those people. Now, no one's perfect, and they didn't live up, the white abolitionists at least did not live up to that perfectly, but I'm going to show you that they did a lot of stuff that you may not have known about. Perhaps you do, and I hope you do. But this is an important thing that's going on. And so this is the context in which Adventism was born. Adventism is a northern religion. It didn't start in the South, and it couldn't have. It couldn't have because we exist because of the anti-slavery movement. That's a thesis that I'm going to share with you today, and I'm going to show that to you this morning. Now, here's something that maybe you've heard. Have you ever heard, stop worrying about social justice, focus on the mission of the church? Have you ever heard, this is a distraction, let's focus on saving souls? My friends, that is a very old argument. That is exactly what the abolitionists faced in their day. And that's because almost every Christian out there was opposed to abolitionism. And you know what the primary way that the tactic that they used? And they explicitly did this. It was silence. And the Christian leaders of the day were saying, you got to be silent on this issue. Abolitionism, they would say, is ripping apart the church. The abolitionists responded and said, no, slavery is ripping apart the church. Slavery is barring the mission. Slavery is preventing the salvation of souls. And that's what they did. And my friends, that's a very familiar kind of thing. So you got to understand those things to understand how Adventists broke that silence. So they did it in a variety of ways, and we're going to talk about petitioning. I've got to go quickly because I don't have a lot of time. So we've got a lot of stuff to cover. I can't give it all to you in the time I got, but because we got a lot of other great things to hear. But let's go through a couple of these. I've just selected some of my favorites. Number one, anti-capital punishment. Have you heard of Adventists being opposed to the death penalty? Now, why is this connected with slavery? It's connected with slavery because during the antebellum period in the North, during this Jim Crow context, a black person was 10 times more likely to be arrested by the police and incarcerated and potentially face the death penalty when they were only comprising 1% of the northern population. Now, we still have a problem with this issue, and we will be discussing that, I'm sure, throughout the day. I've got another presentation this afternoon where I'll be talking about mass incarceration. Okay, but this is going on in that era. And one of our pioneers, one of our church founders, Joseph Bates, and I'm sure many others, is circulating and signing petitions to have the death law, the death penalty abolished. That's a really amazing thing. His wife, Prudence Bates, as well. Some of the founders of our denomination. There's also the issue of Haiti. Perhaps you're familiar with Haiti winning its independence through a slave revolt around the turn of the 19th century. It is the only case in history, world history, where slaves have successfully overthrown their oppressors and gained their freedom permanently. It's amazing. Do you think Americans like that? Do you think white Americans like that? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Now, who had colonized and oppressed and imprisoned and enslaved the Haitians there? Do you know who that was? It was the French, thank you very much. It wasn't the Americans. So why would the Americans be so resistant? Well, here's the funny thing. France eventually they recognize Haiti as an independent nation around 1830 or so. It wouldn't be another 30 years for America to do the same thing. America did not recognize Haiti as an independent nation until 1862, in the middle of the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln was president. Now, why is that the case? There's two main reasons. Number one, white Americans are scared to death of slave revolts, North and South. And they don't want to do anything that seems to sanction that. But abolitionists said, hey, if white people had the right to bear arms and throw off the slavery, as they called it, they did call it that, and oppression of Britain during the Revolutionary War, then should not African-American people have the same right and privilege, right? The second thing that's going on is that just about every single white person in America, based upon their view of the Bible and their understanding of science of the day, backed up with all the authorities you can imagine, they did not think that black people were mentally or physically capable of governing themselves. And so if you recognize an independent nation that's run by black people, that freed themselves from white people, that flies in the face of everything you know and respect, and they would not stand for that. But you have abolitionists and Adventist abolitionists that are signing petitions to have the U.S. recognize the independence of Haiti decades and decades before that ever happened. The two people you see pictured here, this is Stockbridge and Louisa Howland. Their home there in Topsom, Maine, was a major hub for Adventists, and the church was really, in some sense, born in their home. It was so important that the Adventist pioneers called it Fort Howland. The Howlands were the ones that were basically the godparents of the whites' children, because James and Ellen White were traveling all over the place, and so they couldn't take their kids. And so they stayed in the Howlands' home, and they raised them. They're very important people, and they are petitioning to have the U.S. recognize the independence of Haiti long before it ever happened. There's also petitions and protests and other forms of resolutions and things that abolitionists sign, including many Adventists, to have black suffrage in America. Blacks did not have the right to vote in the U.S. In the North, except in the 4 upper New England states of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts. Everywhere else in the North, it was verboten. New York allowed it, kind of. They said a black person could vote if they had $300 worth of property. White people didn't have that restriction. And there were very few black people in the state of New York that had that much property, so it was a very effective way to keep them from voting. Even in those upper New England states, voting could happen technically, but it wasn't until the late 1870s that voting became private in this country. And so everyone knew if you were voting and who you were voting for. And so most black people didn't want to risk their lives potentially to even try to vote, even in New England. So abolitionists are petitioning, signing resolutions, protesting in various ways to have black people get the right to vote. And that means men in this case. Women didn't get the right till the 1919 or so. But in any case, in this era, they're advocating for black manhood suffrage. The tombstone you see here is a Seventh-day Adventist minister named Ezra A. Poole. He's a fun story because he happened to be one of the Lane rebels. I don't know if you know a lot about anti-slavery history, but the Lane rebels in the early 1830s, they made a significant mark because they were trying to just discuss slavery at the Lane Theological Seminary. They were just discussing it. And all of the administration said, you can't even talk about it. You can't utter those words here. It's forbidden. And so Theodore Dwight Weld and several other abolitionists there, including Ezra A. Poole, who later becomes a Millerite minister and then a Seventh-day Adventist minister, he is one of those people that rebels and says, we're out of here then. And with Theodore Dwight Weld, he literally creates a raft, and they sail that down the creek till they get to the Ohio River, and then they go on down to Oberlin College and help start Oberlin College, which, by the way, if you did not know, was a major blueprint for what is now Andrews University. That abolitionist school was the one that Adventists looked at to say, we want to make our school like that. All the manual labor stuff, all the things that's going on there, that's what we're doing. So that's Ezra A. Poole. He's a fun case. There's also the issue of interracial marriage. And so Massachusetts has a very interesting history here because Massachusetts, of course, they don't allow black and white people or Native Americans and white people to intermarry. But Massachusetts abolishes its interracial marriage ban in 1843. It is the only state that does that, and it will take a century more before another state will do that again. And Adventists are involved in a variety of ways of getting that abolished. And so one of those ways is petitioning. And it started mostly with a bunch of white women. It was mostly white women because there were not a whole lot of black people living in the North, but black women were also involved in that. So women are circulating these petitions in 1839. And because most of them are white, the response is rapid and swift. And the press starts to accuse all of these white women. I guess I need to move. I'm using two different screens here. They start accusing all of these white women of wanting to get rid of this interracial marriage ban because they just wanted to have sex with black men. And so you see that depicted here in stuff like this, where there's the amalgamation waltz, where all these white women are dancing with these black men, and the black men have all these exaggerated racial features and so forth. And so this is the kind of response that the North is giving. But then in response to that, all of the men will start petitioning as well in 1840. And Joseph Bates, again, one of our pioneers, as well as numerous other Seventh-day Adventists, they are going to be circulating and signing petitions to abolish Massachusetts' interracial marriage ban, and they will succeed in 1843. Now, please do not think that they're succeeding because all the white people in Massachusetts thought interracial marriage was okay. Victories are often won, but not for the right reasons. And one of the sad but true things about civil rights in America's history is that they tend to win when white people start to feel like their own rights are being violated. And we see that happening in the anti-slavery period as well. And so what happened is the abolitionists won enough seats in the Liberty Party, which I'll explain more about. An abolitionist party won enough seats in the local legislature to where they could barter for power and barter for civil rights legislation, and they got it. But it was not because people in Massachusetts said, oh, yeah, this is okay, we should do this thing. No, not at all. So let's keep going. Let's move on to another thing. I want to talk about that Liberty Party a little bit more. So we'll talk about Adventists that voted. We'll talk about Adventists that voted and so forth to abolish slavery. And it is about the Liberty Party. The Liberty Party is unique in American history because it had only two things on its agenda. Again, I've shared them with you. They wanted immediate total abolition of slavery, and they wanted equal rights for black people. That was it. That was their entire agenda. Nothing else on their platform. That was it. And the Adventists, the Millerite Adventists, this is only going on in the 1840s, they comprised somewhere between 10 and 25% of that political party. This is something that I've uncovered with my research. That's a tremendous amount of power within that party, my friends. And that's a pretty conservative estimate, I believe. There were many actual churches where the Millerite minister, was in charge of what we call liberty churches, where everyone in that church not only voted the liberty ticket, but they were the actual bedrock support of the Liberty Party in that city or town or village. There are many of them. There were many liberty leaders that were Millerites, including the very top leadership. Gerrit Smith, one of the top leaders and thought leaders of that party, was a Millerite, and in 1849, he'll start keeping the seventh-day Sabbath. Alvin Stewart undoubtedly was a Millerite as well. He worshipped in a church that was all Millerite. And Gerrit Smith, his cousin, was the presidential candidate, James G. Birney. So he's closely connected with Adventism too. And these are the people that are doing the most work. Gerrit Smith is a multi-billionaire by today's standards, and he's basically bankrolling the thing in a lot of the anti-slavery movement. And so these are important leaders. Another key leader, Samuel Ringgold Ward. Have you heard of Samuel Ringgold Ward before? One of the most prominent black abolitionists in America's history. He actually is running for vice president of the United States with Gerrit Smith. Gerrit Smith is running for president. Samuel Ringgold Ward is running for vice president in the early 1850s, 1852. And both of those men believe that Jesus is coming soon. Both of those men are Adventists. Okay? You also have numerous Millerite Liberty Party lecturers traveling around the North, speaking against slavery, and then also advocating that they vote the liberty ticket. You've got liberty editors, publishers, newspapers that are promoting Millerism, that are anti-slavery Liberty Party newspapers. And my favorite is that there were actually thousands in fact, of Millerite Adventists who believed that Jesus was coming in 1843 and 1844, and they are running for political office. They are running for political office, even though they believe that they may never serve. The world's going to burn, but they don't care. If Jesus didn't come again, they needed to be in those positions of power so that they could keep fighting for justice. And there were thousands of them, my friends. There would have been thousands of these people. Let me show you just a few of the things here that are just going to illustrate that. So, for example, look at this. You see here, this is Joseph C. Small. He's a Millerite. He's a Christian connectionist, just like James White and Joseph Bates were, and Joshua V. Himes and many other prominent future Seventh-day Adventists and Millerites. He is running for county commissioner in Maine, okay, in Penobscot County. And he's running in 1842. He's a Millerite then. He's running in 1843, still a Millerite. He's running in 1844. The whole way through, there is no blip on the radar. There is no exit. If you have ever been told or thought that Adventists had an abolitionist background and then abandoned it, my friends, that is false. I started this dissertation research because I wanted to know if that was true or not. And it is not only not true, but as you'll see as we keep going, the Millerite Adventists during this period when we had so many Adventists, they actually permanently shaped the anti-slavery movement. We changed America. Now, after the Great Disappointment, things fall apart and we lose so many of those constituents, and the Seventh-day Adventists are so small, we keep going, but we have no major impact. Hate to break it to you. There's only a couple hundred of us. All right? We're so tiny. Okay? But let's show you a few more things here. Here's a couple more. In this image, you see two people who are running for presidential electors in the fall of 1844. See the date at the top, October 17? The Granite Freedom is a Liberty Party newspaper. There you see Peter Clark there and Noah Piper. Those are two Millerite ministers. They're not just Millerite people, they're ministers. And they are running for presidential electors, two of the high. You know what presidential electors do, right? You guys in this room know. Those are the people that actually cast the votes that matter to get the president in. Those are two of the highest offices, right underneath president and vice president. And there's at least two Millerite Adventists that are being run as candidates for that in 1844 in October. That's incredible. William F. Gardner, one of the most prominent abolitionists in New Jersey, he is a prominent Adventist as well, prominent Millerite Adventist. September, we see documentation of him all the way up through the fall of 1844. Very active. He is the secretary of the State Liberty Convention in New Jersey. There's only about 119 people in the Liberty Party in that state, by the way. We're talking about very tiny, but nevertheless very fascinating. J.N.T. Tucker, another prominent Millerite and prominent abolitionist. He's publishing the Liberty Almanac in 1844. So we see clear influence here. Another thing that's really fascinating, if we go to the 20th Congressional District of Ohio, there we have Charles Fitch. Charles Fitch is one of the most prominent Millerite ministers. He is, by the way, someone who, Ellen White, he dies in 1844 because he's baptizing so many people it gets cold, and he dies a week or two before the Great Disappointment. Maybe you've heard of Charles Fitch. Charles Fitch, by the way, Ellen White, in one of her very first visions, she sees this man being in heaven. There's only three people that she ever saw specifically, or names is specifically going to be there. William Miller and Charles Fitch are two of them, and then the other one was the guy that helped her a lot in her spiritual journey in Maine. His name's dropping me. Forgive me for that right now. He's not an abolitionist that I know of, but he maybe had been. But anyways, Charles Fitch is a very prominent person. Had a lot of impact and influence on what would become Seventh-day Adventism. And he is pastoring a church there in Cleveland and is the center of the anti-slavery movement there. He made his church the hub. All of the people coming in and out of the anti-slavery movement, they're coming and they're speaking there, or they're meeting there for some strategy purposes or whatever. And he is aided by Edward Wade, one of the most prominent abolitionists in the state of Ohio and very highly ranked nationally as well. Edward Wade runs for Congress in 1843, 44, and 46. He's an Adventist from early 1840s all the way to the mid-1850s. Okay, and then he finally leaves the Adventist movement at that point. But he is running for Congress there, and they are rallying support in that area and so forth, and gaining a lot of traction. Charles Fitch, in the February of 1844, he will help found the Lake County Liberty Association. This is just a few weeks before they believe that the world is going to end, because the first disappointment was in the end of March. Okay? And so anyhow, before we move on, I guess I went a little bit fast here. Before we move on, there's a couple statistics to understand what happens here. So As the Liberty Party is doing its thing, and as the Millerites there in Cleveland are the driving force of it, you see some major impact here. In Painesville, which is the county seat of Lake County, the vote becomes the third highest in the whole vote total of Ohio. And so Millerites are making that possible. So the third highest vote in the entire state is primarily because of Adventist support. Now, down in Cleveland, just a couple miles away, or a few miles away, between 1842 and 1844, after Charles Fitch moves there, the Liberty vote in Cuyahoga County increased 96.8%, placing it almost a quarter above every other place in Ohio. My friends, Adventism is meant to drive us to activism. Adventism is meant to drive us to be more active and more engaged, not the other way around. Okay? So now let's talk about boycotts and civil disobedience. Okay? Here's the son of a man that I want you to know. This is William K. Platt. He's the son of Elias and Henrietta Platt. Elias and Henrietta Platt are two black Adventists that you need to know about. We didn't know who they were just a few years ago. And one of the reasons it's difficult to find early black Adventists is because in the press, the Review and Herald and stuff, we didn't specify who was black and white. We just see the names showing up, and you don't know, and we just assume they're white. Well, I was going through and looking at things, and I saw that James and Ellen White stayed at Brother and Sister Platt's house when they were in Bath, New York in early 1851. I just got curious. I said, well, who were Brother and Sister Platt? Well, as it turns out, Brother and Sister Platt are two of the most prominent abolitionists in the state of New York, and they are the leading abolitionists there in Bath, and they're African Americans. They were personal friends with Frederick Douglass. They were personal friends with every leading black abolitionist that you can think of. They stopped there at their home every time they were traveling through. Elias Platt is one of the agents for Frederick Douglass's paper. Tragically, Elias Platt will die as he's coming back from digging for gold in Australia in the early 1850s. He will die in 1854. Guess who wrote his obituary? Frederick Douglass. Perhaps the only Seventh-day Adventist that had their obituary written by Frederick Douglass. Although Frederick Douglass has a lot of Adventist connections as well, including his oldest daughter, Rosetta Douglass Sprague, who became a Seventh-day Adventist and remained so during the last decade or a little bit more of her life. But this guy, Elias Platt, he was a grocer. He had a store there in Bath, New York, and he refused to sell slave labor products. That's very hard to do, especially back then. Are you familiar that we still have slave labor products, by the way? One of the things I love to consume is chocolate. Do you like chocolate? Almost all the chocolate in this world is harvested by child slaves, primarily in West Africa. It is very hard. The hardest is ice cream. The only ice cream I have ever found that does not use slave labor chocolate is Ben & Jerry's. That's the only one that I know. There's a great website I can show you about that shows all of the chocolate companies that refuse to use slave labor chocolate. If you want to see that, I'll share that with you later. But this is going on. There's a few Adventists that were doing this kind of thing. Another black Adventist doing this is John West. He had a store there in Peterborough, New York. He also refused to sell slave labor products. There's other boycotts that happen. Transportation, as I mentioned, was segregated in the North. And one of the things that the Adventists are trying to do is to get these laws, these practices abolished. And so Joseph Bates, he's circulating every kind of petition that was out there at the time. You know, I mentioned he's circulating interracial marriage ban, get rid of that. He wants to get rid of that. He wants the U.S. to recognize the independence of Haiti. Every other kind of anti-slavery petition out there, Bates is circulating those. Also anti-capital punishment. So he's involved in this. He's involved in petitioning to have the train companies get rid of the Negro car. You see the image there at the bottom? You see the one right after the engine that's got all the baggage on it? That was the Negro car. You sat on top of people's bags if you took the train. Some of them had a car where there was bags, yeah, but you might be able to sit down, but there's no windows, and you're right behind the engine, so all the smoke, all the dirt, all the dust, all that's going in that space, and you don't want to be there. And that's required. And so Adventists are trying to push against that. And one of the things that's fascinating is in the summer of 1842, that's when the Millerites started to do camp meetings. And Joseph Bates is involved in getting the first camp meeting started. in his region. And so he does what they all did, where you had to try to get the train, he had to work a deal with the train companies so they could stop and have a special stop right where the campgrounds were, way out in the middle of nowhere. And so he contracts with the Taunton and New Bedford train company, railroad company, to have a special stop right where the camp meeting is going to be. And they agree about a week before the camp meeting is going to start that they will not segregate their trains. And it's announced in the Liberator, and all the abolitionists and Millerites they think they're safe and everything's going to be okay. Well, Richard Johnson, a black Millerite, and his daughter, and a group of many, but we don't know the exact number, black Millerites are trying to go via the train to that camp meeting. And there was a notorious white supremacist named George Bird, and he refused, even after they bought first-class passage, to let them get on the train. He says, "You get in that Negro car." And he used a different N-word. I'm not going to say it. And Richard Johnson said, "My sir, we refuse. We paid for this, and we will not degrade ourselves by going in that Jim Crow car." And so that delegation of black Millerites, they paid a higher fee to hire a private conveyance that would take them directly to the campground. Now, other black people and other black Millerites, they didn't have as friendly of an encounter. So Jabez Campbell, who you see pictured here, who becomes quite prominent in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, he tries to ride a train. I think it's either New York or New Jersey, and he is physically assaulted almost to the point of death. And it happens just a few weeks before he believed that Jesus was coming. And he's one of many who were assaulted physically. There were other cases where white abolitionists knew what was going to happen, and they said they wanted to try everything they could do to stop it. So on another case, there's a black man named Ebenezer Jackson, not an Adventist that I know of. We don't know hardly anything about him. But he gets on the white car on a train. And Hugh B. Luge and Daniel Mann, Luge, by the way, is a white Millerite, and Daniel Mann is a white dentist. They hear that, and they immediately go to that car, and they sit around him, and they surround him to try to protect him. Very soon, the conductors and so forth, they say, "Get all those damned abolitionists out of here," starting with this man right here. And they say, "We don't want him, we're happy if he stays. We don't want him to go." And everyone starts to chorus that, and it starts to chant and everything. They don't care, and they violently eject these men out of the train car. Now, remember what I said about white rights? White people saying, "Oh yeah, we'll fight for rights once we see our own rights being denied." That's what happens here. And the abolitionists were smart. They knew that they had to work that way, and so they were willing to do whatever they could to gain a victory. So Daniel Mann sues. And he's a dentist, so he has some clout. He loses. Nevertheless, the abolitionists started a campaign showing people in the North that your white rights are being denied. Do you want that? And they put enough public pressure on the train companies that in 1843 they voluntarily got rid of their practices. Those Jim Crow cars. It was never perfect after that, but Frederick Douglass and many other black abolitionists said it was better. Sometimes victories they're too often won that way, but that's how they approached it. There's also the Underground Railroad, and this is probably familiar territory to you. I could share a lot of things if we had more time about it, but Ellen White commanded us or told us that God wants us to break federal law whenever there is racial injustice involved. The very first time that she ever says that we are in violation of breaking any kind of federal laws, she had race in mind, not a National Sunday law. Should I say that again? Yeah, how many times did we hear National Sunday law, all of that kind of stuff? Yeah, when Ellen White first talks about this, she's talking about issues of racism. And she tells Adventists to break the federal fugitive slave law. You've heard the quotes here. I won't read it. You know the quote, I think. But just so that you know the history, if you were caught aiding and abetting a slave after 1850, you had to face a $1,000 fine and 6 months in jail. This is at a time when the average working person made $1,000 a year. That's a year's wages plus another half of a year out of work. That's going to break you. You might end up in debtor's prison. And Ellen White says this is the will and law of God. Now, why is she saying that? She's saying that because that is the will and law of God. My friends, Deuteronomy 23, 15, and 16 makes it quite clear. And it's a good time to remind us ourselves of this passage. It says, "Thou shalt not deliver to his master the servant," some translations say slave, "which is escaped from his master unto thee. He shall dwell with thee, even among you, in that place where he shall choose, in one of thy gates, where it liketh him best. Thou shalt not oppress him." If this had been followed, God's law says that slavery is optional. Because if someone had run away or tried to run away, that should have clued the slave master in ancient times into the fact that, they don't want to be a slave. Let them have their freedom. Okay, now, that's not a perfect solution. And I know that the Bible has a lot of issues with it. But the abolitionists and Adventists looked at this passage as God's fugitive slave law, saying that slavery is optional. If you were to try to say that the Bible supports slavery, and a lot of people say that today, and we have scholars that back that up, Adventists would look at you like you're crazy. And I think we need to reclaim our anti-slavery teaching and understanding of Scripture, to be perfectly honest with you. So we have many other... There are many other Seventh-day Adventists and so many other Millerite Adventists that operated stops or were involved in the Underground Railroad. Most of the people involved in this work were African American. The people doing the most dangerous cloak and dagger kind of stuff were all blacks. The most prominent in our history is William Still, I would say. And you should know, if you don't, that William Still, who is called the father of the Underground Railroad, he was a lifelong Adventist. He becomes an Adventist, a Millerite Adventist in the early 1840s, and he never gave that up. There are historians who have said otherwise, and my forthcoming book shows that they are wrong. And I don't think they'll be able to say anything different otherwise after this, because it is clear, crystal clear. We found William Still donating money and so forth, and involved in the cause and writing into Adventist newspapers and so forth long after the Great Disappointment. He never gave it up. John Byington, I have him here simply because he was our first General Conference president. And we've known for a long time that he was operating a stop on the Underground Railroad. The historian Brian Strayer has recently written a biography of him, and he has found that Byington even built some places to hide slaves in the churches and parish houses where he lived and worked in upstate New York. And you see them here pictured in his book. He's just one of many, many others. For the sake of time, we're going to keep going. This is a great quote. I've shared it many times, and I love it because it's very raw and it's very direct. Anthony Burns was a Millerite, and he was enslaved in Virginia on a plantation there. Nevertheless, he believed that Christ was coming soon, and later, when his biography is published in 1854, he talks about his Millerite experience briefly there. Well, a decade after the disappointment, he is in Boston. He has liberated himself and so forth, but he is captured and he is reprimanded, and the abolitionists will do everything they can to get him freed. And slave owners are adamant that they will do everything they can to make sure that he is not freed. And the President of the United States at the time is adamant to show that the North and the federal government is going to abide by the fugitive slave law, and he will do everything he can within his power to demonstrate that. So they will not even let abolitionists purchase Anthony Burns' freedom. They will surround that building where he is being tried in a kangaroo sort of trial with federal soldiers around the entire building. They will drag a huge chain and actually chain the entire building, part as a symbol, just to symbolize that it's not going to happen. He's going back to slavery. Well, Adventists are headquartered in Rochester, New York at that time, and one of the leading Adventists there, his name is Edwin R. Seaman. He publishes this in the Review and Herald, and he has this to say, and this is just a short excerpt of a longer thing. And he says, "A man made in God's own image is torn from friends and society and all that is dear in life, and dragged back into slavery by that power of that atrocious bargain, the fugitive slave law. All men are free and equal, and endowed with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And he adds this emphasis, it's not mine. He says, "If this nation would not be the most hypocritical nation on the face of the earth, it should amend this declaration thus: All white men are created free and equal, etc. And then he adds a great theological, very potent theological statement. Has not this two-horned, lamb-like beast corrupted the commandment as well as the Roman dragon? Let me explain that to you so that you don't miss something really important. What he is saying is that America in prophecy, this beast that comes out of the earth, changes laws too. Changes the laws of God just like the Roman beast does. Sure, we may talk about Sunday. Maybe we'll talk about graven images. Let's talk about the fugitive slave law and other black laws that oppress people in America. And there's one time when Uriah Smith prints an entire page of all of the declarations that America gives and all the violations that are done to black people in America. The entire page. Adventists recognized that land beast, that lamb-like beast, as we often refer to it today, it was oppressive, it was nasty, and it changed the law of God. It was just as dangerous as anything that may have come before it. And we need to remember that today. So this leads us into religious protest. The Millerites and early Adventists, they also used religious opportunities and settings to protest. And if I'm getting short on time, someone please let me know, as I don't remember when I stop. I know I've got to stop at some point, and I respect every other speaker, so I don't want to take their time, but I literally don't know when I stop. So 9:30? It's 9:30 now. Okay. I do want to respect people. So do we have a little bit of time? Okay. Some of my favorite things are still coming up here. So I'll make it quick though. Okay. So maybe you thought that when the Millerites are doing their thing and they're going around, they're doing their camp meetings, and when they're preaching, that they're just talking about beasts, they're just talking about timetables, just looking at dates, trying to use their calculators, all that kind of stuff. They did a lot of that. We know that. But the way they typically ended their camp meetings was very different than that. And we see that in the papers. What they do, and what they often did, is they had anti-slavery lecturing that happened. And so in the case of the Salem, Massachusetts camp meeting, they're gathering people. They ring the bell to get everyone into the great tent that seats several thousand people. They ring the bell, and all of a sudden, they hear people singing, "You will see the Lord a-comin', you will see the Lord a-comin', you will see the Lord a-comin' in a few more days." Heard that song before? I'm not a good singer, but I tried. You've heard that song before, maybe, right? Okay, it was one of, if you haven't, we need to introduce it to you. One of the most popular Millerite hymns. And it was written by a former slave, okay? And what they did is it was sung by a company of black abolitionist Millerites who were leading that procession. And they go up onto that stage, and when they get there, it's none of that prophecy stuff, none of that, like beasts and timetables and all of that. They had 2 black ministers come up there and preach against the evils of slavery. This was the climax of the camp meeting because they wanted to emphasize a major point. The coming of Christ is the Jubilee. It is the freedom of everybody, especially the slaves and people that are oppressed. And that is a crucial aspect. And they wanted to literally end with that because that's how things end when Christ comes. There is no going back after that. And they wanted to show that in a ritualistic kind of way to help people understand that a little bit more. The Millerites used other rituals that are really inspiring as well. I want to share just a couple of them with you. I'm sure there's a few people now who've heard me share this. What's called the Grand Amalgamation Festival. The critics called it that. In Philadelphia, where Josiah Litch, one of the most prominent Millerite ministers, is located, they decide to say, okay, we want to show white people in this country what the kingdom of Christ is going to be like, what the kingdom of heaven is going to be like. There will be no Jim Crow cars. There will be no second table for communion where blacks are served last after white people. There will be no Negro pews. We want to show that by demonstrating in a proleptic sense what it will be like. We want to give you a preview. So they say, what we're going to do, and they rent the biggest auditorium in the entire city of Philadelphia, which, by the way, is where most black people live in the north. Okay, the largest population is there. They rent the largest space in the city, and they start going in all the highways and byways and say, let's get all the poor whites and all black people to come in here, and we're just going to feed them. We just want to give them food and a feast, and we are going to sit them around the table, a black person next to a white person to a black person to alternating around the entire table. Talk about bold in that era. Well, it quickly was found out what was going to happen. And how do you think the people responded in America? Oh, they denounced this grand amalgamation festival. And they said, we will not allow that sacrilege to take place in our city. The city of brotherly love, by the way. And so every single place barred and shut their doors to the Millerites. And they refused to let them do that. The Millerites persisted, my friends. They tried everything they could. It took like 4 to 6 weeks, I think, if I'm remembering the dates correctly. And they finally found a venue that would allow them to serve blacks only. And they chose black people over white people. And they served hundreds and hundreds of them a big banquet to demonstrate what the heavenly banquet is going to be like, as a proleptic warning to those who don't want to change, and as a promise for those who are holding on to this hope that we have. That's a powerful, powerful way to use religion. We heard a lot last night, my friends. Let me give you just a brief plug. We have crumbs here. This is what I'm giving you is crumbs. We have what has survived on paper to tell this story. How much of our history have we lost because it never made it on paper? We had an amazing talk last night because this man was living and breathing, Father Flager. He doesn't have a biography, though. I checked. I hope someone writes his story down, because if it isn't, people are going to forget that. That's what happens naturally. So let me make an appeal to you, since I'm a historian who manages an archive. If you have anything out there, I want to preserve your legacy for Adventism. Talk to me afterwards, because we will make sure that your stories are not forgotten. And they can't be. We want to have more than crumbs, and I wish we had more than crumbs here. I'll end with one thing. Well, I got to talk about the switch. Things don't stay this way. There's too much. I want to tell you one thing, the most powerful thing that the Millerite Adventists did. This is where they literally changed America. Charles Fitch, again, before he goes to Cleveland, by the way, he's pastoring at a church called in Haverhill, Massachusetts. And again, it's the center of all anti-slavery activity. That's just the way Charles Fitch operated. Everywhere he went, it was the center of abolitionism in that area. And so his church starts to have a Millerite Adventist revival. And the very first thing that they do is they sign a bunch of resolutions against slavery. And it made a lot of impact, and it went to all of the presses out there, and leading abolitionists said, this is amazing because we haven't heard anything like this from a church in a long time. And they're talking about how they refuse to even associate with people that support slavery. They try to disfellowship everyone in America who's part of whatever denomination they are. They don't have the authority to do that, but it's provocative, right? It's about agitating. And so as the Millerite revival is progressing, and as Charles Fitch is preaching on the soon coming of Jesus, his congregation is stirred more and more and more. And they say, we've got to do something more. We've got to show people that things have got to change and time is running out. See, the Millerites put a deadline. If you don't get things straight, God is coming to judge you. So watch out. They put a deadline on things. That's how radical they were. They put a deadline on this. No other abolitionists did that, but the Millerites, they put a deadline on this. It's, if you don't get it right, God is coming to judge you, and you will burn forever in hell. They did not believe like Adventists do today. We later got that conditional immortality thing sorted out, but they were talking burning forever in hell. Anyhow, so Charles Fitch's members get together, and they meet for an anti-slavery meeting in someone's hat store, Nathan Webster's hat store there, and they say, we got to have a petition, and they know that the South has been threatening to come out of the Union and to secede from the Union. They did that for a long time before they actually did so in the 1860s. And so they said, let's actually just own that. And so they said, let's write a petition where we as abolitionists advocate that the North secede from the South. Let's advocate that America be abolished because of slavery. And so they said, yes, let's do this because we will show the South something that will frighten them to the wall. And so they come up with this petition where they literally advocate for the North to secede from the South, for America to be abolished. And Charles Fitch gets a hold of that petition the next day, and he preaches his sermon, Soon Coming to Jesus. Then they have communion. I believe, we don't know the exact date, but it was probably December 26, 1841, right after Christmas. They hold communion. Then they clear the altar, and Charles Fitch lays his petition on that altar, and he invites his congregation to come and sign. Now, my friends, you need to understand something about the way Charles Fitch thought. That altar was sacred space for him. We don't have that sort of understanding in Adventism today, but that was sacred space. In a petition, a synonym for that word is prayer, even now. And they viewed that as a sacred thing, a prayer to their nation and to their God to end the injustice now. And so they have that petition signed there. Charles Fitch signs it. You see a black and white version of that there. I can show you a better color version of it later on my computer if you want to see it. And after that's done, they try to circulate it around the town and get more people to sign it. But it is so infuriating to people there. People are so angry at this petition. You want to abolish America? Are you crazy? And they try to destroy it. So the abolitionists there, they hide that petition, and they say to people, if you want to sign, we will have you come under the cover of darkness by appointment only. But they only got about, I think, probably one person after that, and after 1 or 2 days, they realized it was so dangerous they couldn't even do that. And they mailed it immediately to John Quincy Adams, ex-president of the United States, who spent a lot of years working in Congress after that until he died. And they said, Adams is the only one with the guts, potentially, to even present this petition to Congress. And you know what? To make a long story short, he did. He did. And it led to at least four major things in America. Number one, Congress put John Quincy Adams on trial for treason. The man who presented the petition, they say, you're a traitor to this nation. They want to burn that petition in the presence of the House. Adams had more death threats at that moment than his entire life put together. Now, he's the most distinguished member there. He's the son of an ex-president. He is an ex-president himself. He's from the founding generation. You can't get rid of him. And Adams is a genius. And so he actually votes with the people who want to put him on trial and says, yeah, let's do this thing. Because he knows that if he gets put on trial there, he has the right to defend himself as long as he wants. He holds the floor in perpetuity until he surrenders it. And so for the next 11 days, week and a half or so, he berates everyone in Congress about the evils of slavery. In the middle, by the way, of their gag laws. From 1836 to 1844, it was forbidden to discuss slavery in Congress. Thank you, Andrew Jackson. That's another thing he did. In addition to kicking all Native American, Trail of Tears, and then also putting Roger Taney, okay, you know about what he does later, okay, with Dred Scott. That's all Andrew Jackson. Anyways, that's a tangent. Anyhow, so Adams is there on trial, and he berates people in the middle of all of this on the evils of slavery. It leads to new ways of activism, especially for black sailors' rights. Black sailors from the North are going down to the South, and they're being thrown in jail or they're being thrown into slavery just because they're black. And so they start to advocate there in Massachusetts for black sailors to have their rights in the South when they're doing their work. And then there's also other things that happen. This is what historians have recognized as the beginning of the end of the gag laws. Those laws that forbid slavery from being discussed. And it literally barely squeaks by after this. And in 1844, it is abolished. And it is because it starts literally with this petition by Millerites in Charles Fitch's church in Haverhill, Massachusetts. That's a lot of impact, friends. Historians say that is the greatest victory over the slave power up to that point in history. That was monumental. That literally changed the nation. Think about it. After slavery is allowed to be discussed from that point on, you know what goes on in the 1850s? Literally, the Congress turns into a bloodbath where people are beaten for even talking and discussing these things. This literally directly leads to the Civil War. This is huge. Every historian out there that talks about this kind of history, they talk about this exact event, but they never talk about the Millerites who signed the petition. I think none of them knew that it was even started that way. They talk about Adam's trial, but they don't talk about what led to the trial. There's another key thing that happens, and I do need to shut up here. This changed the anti-slavery movement. William Lloyd Garrison is so impressed with this disunion tactic of trying to abolish the country because of slavery that no union with slaveholders, this disunionist phrase, literally becomes the motto of the American Anti-Slavery Society from 1844 until the downfall of race-based chattel slavery in 1865. So when we talk about Millerites having impact, we literally, during that period of time, the period that we call the first and second angels' messages, God was working, and Adventists literally changed this nation. There's a lot more that we can say. In closing, I simply want to say that things changed. I could talk about coming out of Babylon, how we come out of the churches. We literally get our existence because we are leaving all the evangelical churches because of slavery. We literally start as an abolitionist movement. Our denomination is an anti-slavery church. We wouldn't have existed without the anti-slavery movement, I am convinced. But things change. And I want to just give you, I want you to know that. I know that. I know that a lot of you know that because this is not the story of Adventism. This is how Adventism began, but not how it continued. And there's three main reasons for that. First of all, the pioneers weren't perfect. I've talked a lot about wonderful things here. But we already know the pioneers weren't perfect. Ellen White, for example, she writes against issues of racial injustice in the Civil War. And she doesn't really say a whole lot until Our Duty to the Colored People, like 25 years later. She later regrets that. Right? But during that period, things start to shift and change. Adventism starts to go south during that period as well. Initially, we have people like Joseph Clark who go down there and they refuse to racially segregate when they're reaching out to black and white people there in Texas. And he survives with his wife for 16 months. And then to save lives, they literally have to flee. They had to leave. There's a great quote that summarizes this. I guess I'm moving just my screen, not yours. I'm sorry. There's a great quote I want to share with you that summarizes a lot of this from Arne Bontom. You know who Arne Bontom is? Arne Bontom is one of the luminaries of the Harlem Renaissance movement. And you know he's a black Adventist leader, I hope too. All right? Hugely influential man in history. He was interviewed in 1950 and he had this to say. He said, in the early years, Adventists were solid on the race question. They began to compromise to appease the South. They are still doing it. Should I say perhaps we still are, at least to some degree, still doing that. And they suffer as a result, and we do suffer as a result. Their younger Negro leaders are fighting at every turn for an abolition of segregation and dual standards. They are not satisfied with their progress, I gather, and I don't blame them. So things had changed. Things have gotten worse in our history over time. We live with lots of problems that are there. There's many things that I would love to share with you here. I'll end with this image here of a protest during the 1960s. This is an image of Adventists protesting, carrying banners through the streets, doing political things. Very political things. We've always been political. We should not be partisan, okay? But we've always been political. And there's a difference there. And this is Adventists that are going through the streets by hundreds of Adventists there carrying signs. Can you read what they say? This is the 1960s. They say, don't elect Trump. I wish they did. Well, he wasn't alive yet, or he wasn't around. Yeah, he was alive, actually. My friends, they say stop cancer, ban the butt, get rid of smoking. At this time in the 1960s, F.D. Nickel and other white Adventist leaders are telling Adventists, you can't get involved in civil rights movement. You got to stay silent on politics. At the very time, they're doing this. Same tactics. The same exact tactics. But it's a different cause. And so for whatever reason, and we know what it is, you can't get involved in politics. Well, that is simply a way to mask racism. That politics card, it has been for a long time. And we know that here. And so, let's change. The reason I'm sharing this information to you is because I believe that we have a platform that we need to re-embrace and stand upon. We talk about the legacies of slavery, and there's a lot of universities around the nation who try to reckon with the legacies of slavery and other businesses and so forth. That is so important. One of my colleagues and friends, Philip Warfield, has talked and advocated and said, hey, we don't have that legacy. We have an anti-slavery legacy. That doesn't mean we're perfect. We're definitely not perfect at all. But we should reclaim that anti-slavery legacy as a platform to build upon to fight for the same cause. It justifies it. If anyone ever tells you to be silent, and I've been told many times myself, I will simply say, well, our pioneers weren't. So why are you thinking that we should? I don't care where you work. I don't care what your office is. I'm not going to be silent. Anyhow, there's a lot more I should say. I'm literally getting off the stage. Happy to talk with you later. Okay, thank you.